prosecution pulling out all the stops as they make their final push to put Diddy away for life. Diddy's son Justin arrived in court to watch the government wind down their case against his music mogul dad.
Netflix's documentary Season 4 didn't accuse Diddy of anything, but it did something more powerful. It slowly walked viewers toward one idea that's now everywhere: life sentence. Not from a judge, but from the story itself. From the opening moments of Season 4, something feels noticeably different. Not aggressive, not emotional, just controlled. The pacing slows down. The music stays restrained. The narration avoids strong language. Instead of telling you what happened with Diddy, the documentary invites you to watch how events connected over time. That choice matters more than most people realize. Netflix doesn't rush the audience toward conclusions about Diddy. It doesn't chase viral shock or dramatic accusations. It lets scenes breathe longer than expected. Old footage involving Diddy lingers on screen. Interviews pause mid-sentence. Dates appear without explanation. And that silence creates tension, the kind that makes viewers lean in instead of clicking away. What Season 4 understands very well is how the human mind processes stories, especially when they involve powerful public figures like Diddy. People don't trust narratives that push too hard. They trust narratives that let them connect the dots themselves. So instead of direct claims, the documentary relies on structure. Timelines repeat, names reappear. Certain moments involving Diddy are shown more than once, each time with slightly more context. At first, none of it feels heavy, but slowly the weight builds. By the second episode, viewers start to notice patterns. Not accusations patterns. Conversations connected to Diddy that don't fully resolve. Statements that feel carefully chosen. Moments where responsibility seems implied but never spoken. Netflix never says, "This is the conclusion about Diddy." It lets the audience arrive there on their own. That's where the phrase life sentence quietly enters the conversation. Not as a legal term tied to Diddy, not as a prediction about him, but as a feeling surrounding the story. The documentary shows how reputation shifts, how doors close, how silence replaces influence, how public perception around Diddy hardens over time. And when viewers see enough of those moments stacked together, they begin to associate them with permanence, with something that doesn't easily reverse. This is where many people stop watching as fans of celebrity culture and start watching as judges of Diddy's legacy. And that shift is powerful. Season 4 doesn't rely on one explosive moment involving Diddy. It relies on accumulation. Each episode adds another layer, another timeline, another unanswered question connected to Diddy's public image. By the time viewers reach the middle of the season, the tone has changed. What once felt like an investigation now feels like a conclusion quietly forming around Diddy. What makes this especially effective is what the documentary avoids. There's no dramatic countdown related to Diddy, no narrator announcing a turning point. Instead, it feels like everything has already changed, and the audience is only now catching up to how the story around Diddy is being framed. That creates a sense of inevitability, and inevitability is far more persuasive than shock. Before we continue, I want you to pause and think about this. When a documentary reaches millions of viewers worldwide, does it simply present information? Or does it quietly shape how someone like Diddy will be remembered long before any final outcome exists? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want calm, deep, fact-focused storytelling without exaggeration, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. This story around Diddy is still unfolding. Online reactions reflect this perfectly. People aren't debating specific legal details about Diddy. They're reacting emotionally. Words like final, dark, and no way back appear again and again in discussions. Those aren't legal arguments, they're emotional verdicts forming around Diddy. Netflix never tells viewers to think that way about Diddy, but the structure of Season 4 leads them there. Silence plays a major role too. There are scenes where the documentary steps back completely. No commentary, no guiding voice, just footage, time, and moments connected to Diddy's past. Those pauses force viewers to sit with discomfort. And when people are uncomfortable, they search for meaning. That meaning becomes personal, which makes it stick. Another subtle move Season 4 uses is recontextualization. Old interviews involving Diddy that once felt harmless now feel tense. Past headlines about Diddy that seem forgettable now feel loaded. Netflix doesn't say those moments mattered back then. It shows why they feel important now. That difference matters, because once viewers reinterpret the past around Diddy, the future feels limited. By the end of the early episodes, the question is no longer, what happened with Diddy? It becomes, how did the situation around Diddy reach a point where this feels permanent? And once that question takes hold, viewers keep watching not for answers, but for confirmation. This is where controversy begins to grow. Some critics argue the season crosses an invisible line, not legally, but emotionally when telling Diddy's story. Others argue it's simply reflecting what people already believe. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Season 4 doesn't deliver a verdict on Diddy, it delivers gravity. And gravity pulls everything downward, whether you name it or not. What keeps audiences locked in isn't outrage, it's restraint. Every episode feels like it's holding something back about Diddy. And that tension creates a promise that the next moment might finally explain what all of this means. But instead of release, the pressure increases. By the time the screen fades to black, viewers aren't asking whether the life sentence narrative around Diddy is fair. They're asking why it feels so real. And when a story reaches that point, walking away becomes almost impossible. Because this is no longer just a documentary about Diddy. It's a narrative that's reshaping how millions of people understand Diddy's situation long before any final outcome has ever been decided. And that's only the beginning. As Season 4 moves forward, the focus quietly shifts not from facts, but from impact. The documentary stops looking only at what happened around Diddy and starts showing what changed because of it. Not dramatic fallout, not public explosions, just subtle consequences unfolding in real time. Invitations connected to Diddy stop appearing. Partnerships feel distant. Public appearances become smaller, more controlled, more cautious. None of this is framed as punishment. Netflix never labels it that way. But when these moments are stacked together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. What Netflix does next is especially calculated. It introduces public reaction without letting it take control. Social media clips flash by briefly. Headlines appear and disappear without emphasis. Commentary exists, but only at the edges. The documentary doesn't amplify opinions, it shows that they already exist. That's when viewers realize something important. The story around Diddy is no longer contained within the documentary. It has moved outside of it. At this stage, Season 4 makes it clear that narratives don't need constant updates to survive. Once a certain version of events surrounding Diddy becomes dominant, it feeds on repetition, on discussion, on silence, on the absence of contradiction. Silence becomes a central theme again, but not silence from Netflix. Silence from places where noise used to exist. Statements don't come. Reactions don't follow. Conversations involving Diddy feel carefully avoided rather than openly addressed. The documentary never explains this silence. It simply shows that it's there, and that absence becomes part of the narrative itself. This is where the pressure increases for the viewer, not because something shocking is revealed, but because something familiar is missing. In public storytelling, silence is rarely neutral. It invites interpretation. And once interpretation spreads widely enough, it turns into belief. Season 4 leans into this carefully. It shows how public opinion around Diddy doesn't form all at once. It forms in stages. First curiosity, then discomfort, then certainty. Netflix never labels these stages, but the progression is unmistakable. By now, the phrase life sentence has taken on a new meaning in conversations about Diddy. It's no longer just a phrase repeated online. It becomes shorthand for permanence, for damage that doesn't fade easily, for a future that feels narrower than the past. Again, none of this is said directly, it's felt. The documentary also begins to show how difficult it is to change a narrative once it solidifies. Attempts to add nuance arrive late. Context struggles to compete with momentum. Even neutral facts about Sean Combs are reinterpreted through a lens that is already formed. This is where viewers start to understand the real power of storytelling. Because the law moves slowly, but perception moves fast. And when perception around Diddy settles before any official outcome is reached, the emotional conclusion feels decided long before anything formal happens. Netflix doesn't suggest this is right or wrong. It simply shows that this is how modern narratives operate. One of the most unsettling parts of this stretch is how normal everything feels. There's no chaos, no public meltdown. Life continues, and that normalcy sends its own message. The story around Diddy doesn't feel like it's building toward a dramatic turning point. It feels like it has already passed one. This creates a strange tension for the viewer. On one hand, nothing explosive is happening. On the other, everything feels heavier. That emotional contradiction keeps people watching. They're waiting for clarity that never fully arrives. Instead, the documentary offers perspective. It shows how quickly public identity can shift, how someone once defined by success becomes defined by suspicion, how past achievements connected to Diddy stop protecting future perception. None of this is framed as justice or injustice. It's framed as reality. And that framing is what separates Season 4 from earlier chapters. Earlier seasons ask questions about Diddy's world. This season observes outcomes around Diddy. By now, viewers aren't watching to learn new details. They're watching to understand scale, how far the narrative has spread, how deeply it has settled, and whether there is any realistic path back from it. The documentary doesn't answer that. Instead, it widens the lens. It introduces quiet reminders of similar moments in public history, not as direct comparisons to Diddy, but as context. Situations where public opinion moved faster than formal decisions, where reputations were reshaped regardless of eventual outcomes. That context does something important. It makes the situation around Diddy feel less isolated and more systemic. Less about one person and more about how modern media ecosystems function once momentum takes over. By the end of this section, the feeling shifts again. Curiosity fades. Tension remains. But acceptance begins to creep in. The sense that something irreversible may already be underway, whether acknowledged or not. And that's when a new question quietly forms in the viewer's mind. Not what will happen next to Diddy, but can this story about Diddy still change at all? That question isn't answered here. It's carried forward, because the deeper Season 4 goes, the clearer it becomes that the strongest forces shaping Diddy's narrative aren't legal documents or official statements. They're perception, momentum, and the stories people repeat when they think no one is listening. And those forces don't wait. They move on their own, and they're not finished yet. By this point in Season 4, something critical has changed, not in the information itself, but in who controls it. Early on, the story around Diddy felt guided, almost contained. Each episode moved carefully, as if the narrative still had boundaries. Now those boundaries are gone. The documentary shows that the conversation about Diddy no longer belongs to Netflix. It belongs to everyone. This is where media echo takes over. Clips from the documentary begin circulating without context. Quotes are shortened, moments are isolated and replayed again and again. Each time they resurface, they lose complexity and gain certainty. What once felt like a question about Diddy slowly starts to sound like an answer. Netflix never has to explain this. You can feel it happening. The same phrases appear across different platforms. The same scenes involving Diddy are referenced in different tones: serious, casual, even dismissive. But regardless of tone, they all point in the same direction. The outcome feels settled even though nothing official has been declared. This is where reputational damage around Diddy becomes something deeper than controversy. It becomes association. It's not about accusations anymore. It's about how Diddy's name feels when it's mentioned, about the pause that follows, about the way conversations shift when his name enters the room. Season 4 captures this indirectly, through absence rather than presence. The absence of correction, the absence of balance, the absence of urgency to slow down. Those absences speak loudly. One of the most unsettling things the documentary highlights is how quickly complexity disappears once a dominant narrative forms around Diddy. Real life is layered and uncertain. Stories rarely are. Once momentum takes hold, everything simplifies. Motives seem obvious. Outcomes feel inevitable. Even uncertainty starts to look like confirmation. Netflix doesn't frame this as manipulation. It frames it as momentum, and momentum is difficult to stop. As the episodes continue, the documentary begins to feel less like a series and more like a mirror. It reflects not just what's being shown, but how audiences respond to it. Reaction videos, comment sections, analysis clips, all feeding into each other, all reinforcing the same interpretation of Diddy's situation. At this stage, viewers may not even realize they're participating in the process. Watching becomes agreement. Sharing becomes reinforcement. Silence becomes acceptance. That's how narratives harden. Season 4 also touches on something deeper here, the idea that once a public image like Diddy's crosses a certain line, recovery becomes almost impossible, not because of evidence, but because of fatigue. People stop wanting updates. They stop asking questions. The story feels finished in their minds. And when that happens, new information struggles to land. This is where the phrase life sentence stops being symbolic and starts feeling psychological. It represents permanence in the public imagination, a version of Diddy frozen in time, regardless of what may still change behind the scenes. Netflix never claims this is fair, but it shows that it's real. Another quiet shift happens during this stretch. The audience stops looking forward. Earlier episodes promised discovery. Now the draw is confirmation. Viewers aren't watching to learn something new about Diddy, they're watching to see if their interpretation continues to hold. Every episode that doesn't challenge that interpretation strengthens it. This is dangerous territory for any story, because once confirmation replaces curiosity, the narrative closes. Season 4 hints at this closure without announcing it. The tone becomes reflective. The pacing slows. The music softens. It feels less like the documentary is building toward a moment and more like it's observing the aftermath of one. That emotional shift is subtle, but powerful. It tells viewers without saying it that something has already ended. Not legally, not officially, but culturally. And culture is where reputations like Diddy's truly live. What makes this even more compelling is how ordinary everything appears on the surface. There's no dramatic collapse, no single breaking headline, just a slow narrowing of space, a shrinking future, a sense that the range of possible outcomes for Diddy has quietly collapsed. Season 4 doesn't dramatize that collapse. It lets it feel inevitable. That's what keeps people watching through this section. They're trying to pinpoint when the turning point happened and slowly realizing it may have happened long before the documentary ever aired. That realization is uncomfortable because it suggests that narratives don't wait for confirmation. They move ahead, pulling reality behind them. By now, the viewer is no longer neutral. Even if they resist the framing, they're aware of it. They feel its pull. They recognize how far it's spread, and that awareness creates tension between skepticism and acceptance. That tension doesn't resolve here. It tightens. The final moments of this section don't offer answers. They offer perspective. They show how once a story around someone like Diddy grows large enough, no single voice can redirect it. Not platforms, not statements, not even time. At that scale, narratives don't respond. They persist. And the most unsettling part is this: the documentary hasn't ended yet. But for many viewers, the story about Diddy already has. That gap between perception and reality is where the next phase begins. Because when the public believes a story's finished, any attempt to reopen it comes at a cost. And that cost is where everything gets heavier. Much heavier. By the time Season 4 reaches its final stretch, the shift is undeniable. The documentary is no longer trying to explain what happened around Diddy. It's capturing a moment where perception hardened, where opinions settled, and where the story stopped feeling open-ended. The pacing slows even more. Scenes linger. Pauses feel deliberate. Netflix isn't building suspense anymore. It's letting weight sink in. The kind of weight that doesn't need dramatic music or strong words. It's already there. This is where the idea introduced at the very beginning comes full circle. Not a life sentence decided in a courtroom, but a life sentence formed in public memory around Diddy. Season 4 never says that directly, but everything points toward it. The final episodes focus less on events and more on impact. How narratives linger, how reputations freeze, how time doesn't always soften perception, sometimes it locks it in place. The documentary shows how once a story about Diddy reaches a certain scale, It no longer needs updates to survive. It becomes self-sustaining. That realization is unsettling for many viewers, because even if nothing new happens, the story keeps moving. Netflix also avoids offering closure. There's no resolution, no final summary telling viewers how to feel about Diddy. Instead, the documentary leaves uncomfortable space where viewers are forced to sit with their own conclusions and recognize how firmly those conclusions have already formed. This is where the psychological impact becomes impossible to ignore. By now, the phrase life sentence doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost ordinary. And that's the danger. When an idea becomes normal, it stops being questioned. It becomes background truth. Season 4 shows how that happens. Not through accusations, not through claims, but through framing, repetition, and absence. Absence of balance, absence of urgency, absence of uncertainty. Netflix doesn't argue whether this is right or wrong for Diddy. It simply shows how modern narratives work. And once viewers recognize that pattern, they can't unsee it. That's why the ending feels heavy. There's no explosive final scene, no shocking reveal, just a slow fade as if to suggest that the story isn't ending. It's settling, like dust after a collapse. Everything has already fallen. Now it's just landing. What makes this especially powerful is that Netflix steps back at the end. It doesn't try to control the final takeaway about Diddy. It allows the audience to walk away with the version of the story they've already built in their own minds. And for many people, that version feels permanent. This is where the real question emerges, not about guilt or innocence, but about narrative power, about what happens when a story becomes bigger than facts, bigger than timelines, bigger than outcomes that haven't even arrived yet. Because once public memory locks onto a version of events around Diddy, changing it becomes incredibly difficult. That's what Season 4 ultimately captures. Not a verdict on Diddy, not a prediction about Diddy, but a shift. A shift from wait and see to this is how it will be remembered. And that's why so many viewers finish the season feeling uneasy. Not because they were told what to believe, but because they realize how easily belief formed on its own. The documentary ends quietly, but the conversation doesn't. It continues online, in clips, in comments, in reactions. Each repetition reinforces the same idea. Each share hardens the same interpretation. Over time, the story around Diddy stops feeling like a discussion. It starts feeling like history. That's the true weight of what Season 4 did. It didn't push a legal outcome. It pushed a cultural one, a version of events that may exist long before and long after any final decision is ever made. Which brings us back to the beginning. A life sentence not delivered by a judge, but by the story itself. And once a story reaches that point, the hardest part isn't proving anything wrong about Diddy. It's changing what people already believe is finished. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think documentaries should simply present information? Or do they carry responsibility for how narratives shape public memory around figures like Diddy? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more calm, fact-focused breakdowns like this, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. We'll keep following stories like this, not for headlines, but for understanding.